We are now excited for our next Fireside Chat between two phenomenal practitioners. Here to introduce our Fireside Chat is our NICE Planning Committee Industry Chair, Kiersten Royster. Kiersten serves as Senior Vice President for Global Cybersecurity Public Policy at Bank of America. Thanks so much for being here with us, Kiersten. The floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Brian. And I'm so happy to be here today and take part in the NICE Symposium. As Brian mentioned, I currently have the privilege of serving as the industry co-chair of the NICE Planning Committee, and I thoroughly enjoyed working with the NICE team and other partners in government, academia, and industry to plan the upcoming 2022 NICE Conference in Atlanta. And for those of you who want to continue to be part of these conversations, I strongly encourage you to submit a proposal to present at next year's conference in Atlanta. Today, we live in an exceedingly interconnected world, and it is critical that we have cybersecurity professionals to develop and secure the networks that we all rely on, and we have users who understand how to securely engage in our connected world. And as someone who has worked in cybersecurity in both industry and government roles, I know that the need for strong cybersecurity education, training, and workforce development programs transcends all sectors. It is so important for us to collaborate and share ideas, issues, and best practices to continue to improve cyber education at all levels, while also building and maintaining the cyber workforce that we need. And today, I have the honor of introducing our Fireside Chat participants who are also committed to these efforts. So needless to say, you've probably heard a lot about these folks and their organizations in the past several months as they have hit the ground running in their current roles. First, we have Chris Inglis, who is the first U.S. National Cyber Director, serving as Principal Advisor to the President on cybersecurity policy and strategy, as well as cybersecurity engagement with industry and international stakeholders. And prior to this role, he served as Deputy Director of the National Security Agency. Originally, CISA Director Jen Easterly was going to be able to participate in today's Fireside Chat, but she was called away. However, we're excited to have Kiersten Todt in her place today, joining Chris. Kiersten is the Chief of Staff over at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, directly supporting Director Easterly. And as CISA's Chief of Staff, she is responsible for the planning, resource allocation, and development of long-range objectives in support of the department's goals and milestones. And she also provides strategic vision, guidance, and direction to ensure that Director Easterly is prepared to respond to threats to the homeland. Prior to joining CISA, Kiersten had a number of cyber roles in government, industry, academia, and the nonprofit sector. And finally, moderating today's discussion is JJ Green, who is the National Security Correspondent at WTOP Radio. He reports daily on international security, intelligence, foreign policy, terrorism, and cyber developments, and provides regular on-air analysis. JJ, over to you.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. And thank you to the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education for giving me the opportunity to do this today. Thank you, Director Inglis, for joining us, and Kiersten Todt as well. I don't see you, but I'm assuming you're there. There you are. Thank you for being with us. And normally when you have fireside chats, it's my understanding you start with some pleasantries usually. So considering this is a virtual one, we'll try it. Today is someone's birthday. Today is actually the anniversary of CISA, 3 years to the day today. So Kiersten, we want to say happy birthday or happy anniversary, whichever you prefer today.
Thank you.
So thank you both. Thank you both for joining us. Just to get right into this, let me just say, Director Inglis, I've wanted to interview you forever. So now is the time, and I promise not to ask any old questions. I'm just going to stick to the script today. But thank you both for being here. The top 10 supply chain risk. Everything from political and government changes to economic instability, extreme weather events, environmental risk, catastrophes, connectivity, cyber attacks, data integrity and quality. We're going to discuss some of those things today, but let me just start with you first, Director Inglis. From your vantage point, what are the most pressing cybersecurity threats to our nation, and how do they impact the supply chain?
Yeah, so JJ, it's nice to be with you as well. I'm a longtime fan. I've listened to you quite a lot, and so it's finally great to meet you, at least in this this format. And Kiersten, to all of your colleagues, happy third birthday. Good luck for the next 67. It's a great question. So let me answer it this way, not obliquely, but with malice aforethought. I think that we could easily point to kind of the transgressors that live in the safe havens in the near abroad of Russia, or criminal gangs, or even some nation states that prosecute that. That's the true source of this threat. But I think what actually gives them traction, gives them purchase, is the fact that we're not actually joined up on our side. We have a doctrinal problem, which is we're not sure, in many cases for these supply chains, who's accountable for what, who actually defends the threaded kind of supply chain that goes from producer to consumer. What are the various roles of individuals, organizations, or governments, plural, and some degree of complacency. And I would say that this is an ambivalent complacency, not an intentional complacency, but some degree of complacency of it must be somebody else's problem. It's all of our problems, and we have to figure out how we use all the talent, all of the expertise in the room to address this. And so if there's a number one issue that I think we should address, is we need to figure out who is accountable for what, and make sure that our people skills and our doctrine are up to the cause. Ultimately, we'll find that technology also needs to be addressed, but if we don't get the first two parts right, it's a fool's errand to simply work on the third.
So how far along are we on that process of joining up everything and everyone that need to be joined up to attack these issues that you've highlighted?
Well, I think we're well along the journey, but we're nowhere near complete. I would simply say that, like climate change, this has been long in the making. When you look back and say, when was it that we perhaps missed our opportunity to properly define what this interconnected domain was, or how we depended on it, or how we should invest resilience and robustness in it? You could go back 40 years for some of the kind of the antecedents here. That being said, there is an awareness now that I think is shared by everyone that there is a problem. Not everyone understands that they each have a role to play in this. And so there's some further awareness and education that's required. And in terms of joining up, you can see that within different sectors and across some sectors, and between the private sector and the public sector, there's some very commendable efforts that are underway that would essentially say, how do we actually address this together? And increasingly the proposition must be, how do we make it such that a transgressor has to defeat all of us to defeat one of us? I would commend the work that's happening over at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and something they call the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative. Forget the term. It's a place where there are private and public sector individuals who co-discover, co-mitigate threats on the fly. That's new, that's different, it's transformative.
Thank you. Thank you. And over to you, Kiersten. Todd, he mentioned the work that CISA is doing. And by the way, CISA is one of my favorite government agencies because, I can actually see on a regular basis what you're doing. I mean, I get a lot of information from your organization on a daily basis about what you're doing. But I want you to, if you will, answer that same question, what the most pressing security threats are to our nation and how they impact the supply chain, but also do it in the context of how CISA is working on it on a daily basis.
Well, thanks very much, JJ, and it's great to be with you, and always an honor and a pleasure to be speaking with Director Inglis. It's a terrific question because it really gets at so many of the issues that we're dealing with in cybersecurity, and I'll work off of what Director Inglis is talking about, because I think from CISA's perspective, one of the key elements that we're focused on as we look to help the government defend its networks and also to work with industry is how do we make cybersecurity accessible to every individual? We have to ensure that individuals feel the accountability and the responsibility for cybersecurity. And that doesn't mean out of fear, but it's much more out of empowerment and knowledge and education. And we need to do that by focusing on human behavior. And human behavior is really where we can create the foundation of resilience. And we heard earlier from Kevin Gallagher talking about small businesses and supply chain. we've got to start with the individual. Individuals comprise those small businesses and the larger businesses. And if they are doing the basics, when we look at multi-factor authentication, we look at software updates, strong passwords, phishing education and training. It sounds simple in the sense of when we think of cyber and big threats, we think big technology, but it absolutely is the building block and the foundation for the security and the resilience of the nation, the education of individuals and the awareness that they need to have in cybersecurity.
Now you talk about human behavior, and I heard what Anne-Marie Slaughter said earlier, that cybersecurity is a security issue. It's a national issue, it's a state, local, it's a company and industry problem, it's a personal problem as well. How do you get people to stop and take a minute to listen to what you're saying? Because talking to some of the folks that I have spoken to in the numerous interviews I've done about cybersecurity over the years, it's hard to get and keep Americans' attentions about what is this is a game changer, but still people just don't seem to be listening. So how do you get people to listen to this?
Well, we've heard a lot over the last couple of months that we're at an inflection point. And like a lot of cyber terms, sometimes it can be overused, but I do think we are at an inflection point because the events that have happened over the last year have really raised awareness to the consumer, to the citizen about how cybersecurity can affect their life. I live in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and after Colonial Pipeline, saw the lines outside of gas stations. And that wasn't even because there was a scarcity of gas, but it was because there was the fear that there was going to be no gas. And when you think about that, and when it hits the kitchen table, when it hits the pocketbook, that's when people start to pay attention to it. I don't believe that psychologically we're going to have in the near term, perhaps a cyber Pearl Harbor. But what I do think is when individuals have the impact to their life, they start to pay attention. And one of the things that we did this year following Director Easterly's beginning of her time here at CISA was we had Cybersecurity Awareness Month launched by the National Cybersecurity Center that focused on awareness, public awareness partnerships. And this was one of our first efforts to really look at how do we reach individuals. We're also looking at a public awareness campaign that can be accessible and practical. It doesn't help if we give guidance that people don't understand, or it doesn't make sense, it's not practical to them. But if we can start with the basics, a CISO of a large organization, global organization, shared with me a couple of weeks ago that his aspiration is to eliminate single-factor authentication by 2025. The idea that if we have multi-factor authentication, if everybody does that and understands what that is, that we will eliminate a lot of the threats. Now, I think it's always careful to remember, we have to be careful to remember that there's no holy grail in cybersecurity, that there's not one thing that we can do, but all of these things start to build on each other, and helping individuals understand their role and creating those campaigns that are accessible will help to move forward and make progress in that area.
Let me jump back over to you, Director English, again, using her remarks to kind of move into this new piece of this conversation. The people are the key functionary here. I mean, we've got some very sophisticated systems and some very sophisticated technologies, but we've got, at the end of the day, people that run these systems and these technologies. And at the same time, and looking back at your national security, your NSA background, we know that the adversaries are constantly, their people are constantly looking at what we're doing and how we're changing too. So from your perch as the National Cyber Director, and taking into account what you've learned through all of your years at NSA before and since then, what are you doing? What needs to be done to stay ahead of the adversaries who are trying to, even today, probably watching this, to figure out how they can figure out the next big trick to try? So what's the goal, or how do you get there in staying ahead of them? What do you do to stay ahead of them, considering that they're probably spending as much time and energy and resources trying to fight this as you are trying to do?
JJ, that's a really good point. And so first, I think we need to study ourselves as hard and thoroughly as they have studied us. When an adversary, transgressor, whether that's a nation state or some criminal gang, looks at us and our dependence on digital infrastructure, the internet or cyberspace, they assess that that is comprised, that body of kind of technology is actually built of three things. They look at the technology, of course, see whether there's something they can do to exploit that. They look at the people who are not simply served by it, but they're a part of it. They make choices all day that determine the performance of cyberspace. And they look at the doctrine, that term that I'd mentioned earlier. They look at roles and responsibilities. And typically, classically, when they take advantage of a weakness in that system, they go in reverse order. They first find a seam or a shadow that, two people think that the other one is defending something of common interest when nobody is. So they go between that seam, or they take advantage of someone who is not prepared to be the strongest link in the chain. They're kind of exercising bad cyber hygiene. 90% of the events that we would describe as intrusions or breaches in this space are attributable to the human being. And not all of them are trying to do the wrong thing. The vast majority of them are not trying to do the wrong thing. So we need to look at that the way they do and try to figure out, what do we do about that? I think three things. One, we need to double down on resilience and robustness, make ourselves a harder target. Technology, of course, needs to play a role. Gone are the days when we should force a user to negotiate for security built into the system they just bought, in the same way that they don't have to negotiate for an airbag or anti-lock brakes on their automobile. It should come built in. But people, they need to be up to the game. And we've talked about that a little earlier in this conversation, not just the people who have cyber or IT in their names, but everyone. Everyone needs to be digitally aware. For the most part, people are app natives. They're not digital natives. They really don't know how to defend themselves. They don't know what happens when they click on the link. They don't know as much about cyberspace as they know about not to touch a hot stove. And so we need to make sure we improve that. And then on doctrine, I've already described that we need to move to a place where you can't beat one of us without beating all of us. We need to actually collaborate and integrate our defenses. Now, if we do that, that would constitute a basis of what I would call deterrence by denial. It's a fancy term that we borrow from other domains of interest, but essentially it makes us a sufficiently hard target that some of the transgressors simply won't bother. And still leave some people on the field. We need to be able to find and bring them to justice. And so we need to do deterrence by cost imposition. So we need to improve our game in terms of, can we find anomalies in this space? Can we attribute those anomalies? Can we bring them to justice using all the means available, right? Our financial sanctions, our legal remedies, our diplomatic remedies, the whole 9 yards. And at the end of the day, and if on occasion we need to bring that infrastructure that they're using against us down by using cyber methods, so be it. But it's an all instruments of power proposition. What's missing at the moment is we haven't put all those pieces together such that we have a comprehensive strategy to make it such that we're a harder target, or that if you come after us, we'll catch you in the bargain, or that if you succeed in coming after us, we'll impose a cost on you such that you'll rethink your deliberations. And to Kiersten's point, and to what I think CISA has done so well, we need to make sure that there are rewards for good behavior in this space as well. If you've done your job, if you've essentially done your part on resilience, robustness, and you find yourself the victim of something that simply overwhelms you, we can't stand idly by and let you kind of drown in that kind of raging sea. And we can't do what we might have done in the past, which is to show up, find, and stab the wounded. We need to make sure that we bring real service in a timely way to assist the individuals, the organizations, the sectors that find themselves on the vanguard of something that at the moment is just really hard. I think we do all of those things. That makes a determinative difference, and people are the core issue.
Kiersten, I want to jump over to you to see what your thoughts are about that, and also throw this at you as well. Is there something that CISA has found that works particularly well for dealing with the type of adversarial threats that Director Inglis was talking about, those opportunistic ones, and then the others that are pretty well thought out? Where are you on those?
Well, so first, I would just really want to emphasize something Director Inglis has said today and has said before, which I think is so critical, which is, in order to defeat one of us, you have to defeat all of us. And he's also used the term, this unassailable truth of partnerships across government and industry. And I think this is critical, because the collaboration and this whole of government, whole of nation approach is where resilience exists. And when we think about how to ward off adversaries, obviously there are different elements, but one of the pieces that we're starting to look at very closely at CISA is, how do we catalyze the research and development community, the hacker community, to work with us so that we can defend more strongly? I think this is something we talk a lot about, offense in this space, but the defensive side of this goes to the resilience piece. I was speaking with a senior executive at a bank in Europe, talking about how to measure success. And obviously in cybersecurity, metrics are very difficult. And she said to me, I don't measure my success by what I've prevented for this financial institution. I measure it by how I respond when something happens. And that goes to that resilience piece. So how are we preparing ourselves to minimize disruption when something does happen, to ensure that continuity of operations is not disrupted? But importantly, how are we defending ourselves against those types of threats so that we can be stronger?
You know, education is a really big part of this situation, dealing with everything that has to be done in order to make sure that U.S. cybersecurity, national security, state, local, whatever you want to call it, is dealt with effectively. And I know, Kiersten, Todd, that DHS has a cybersecurity talent management system designed in part to deal with this. So can you tell us more about what that is, how it works?
Sure, we just launched it yesterday, so it's brand new, and the idea here is to have different hiring authorities that allow CISA and the Department of Homeland Security to attract cyber talent in the space. We're looking at different ways of identifying talent, attracting it, and retaining it through a different type of information and employment structure. And when we look at the priorities in cybersecurity, obviously workforce is absolutely number one. Director Easterly has talked extensively about this and how we build out our talent management system and the pipeline within CISA. And one of the key pieces to this is partnerships with organizations. This isn't just about going to the usual suspects, but partnerships with community colleges, with vocational schools, with high schools, other places where we can identify that talent at all ages. Director Easterly talks about K through gray, the education and the training, but also the reskilling of individuals mid-career and in other places. And the other piece to this that is so important is our efforts on diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. This is not a check the box exercise. This is very much about, if we truly believe in diversity of opinion, in diversity of perspectives, we need to employ a diverse workforce. And we're prioritizing these elements. We just announced a partnership with two nonprofits, Empower and Cyber Warrior, with whom we're working on collaborating to identify individuals in underserved communities, rural populations, veterans, military spouses, women of color, young women of color, and other elements and other individuals that play a key role in how we're building this out. The other point that I'll make, because I'm particularly proud of this, I've worked in this space for a while, is that CISA will be the second federal agency to work with MITRE on a neurodiversity project where we will be employing 4 individuals with autism. Again, this goes to how we bring in diversity of perspectives, because cybersecurity is an interdisciplinary challenge. We need individuals with expertise in psychology, history, sociology, politics, economics. And so our efforts in building out this talent management and this talent management system really focus on recruiting from all aspects of the nation and of the world.
We've heard several times the president talk about cybersecurity and its importance as we move forward towards the future. And we've also heard him talk about some of the bad actors that are out there that are increasingly skilled in this. And so we know that this is a top tier issue, top tier concern. And Director Inglis, can you tell us, and you as well, Ms. Todd, how your organizations work together to achieve the objectives that the president and others in the government want to lay out, and make it and do it in such a way that there's measurable progress, especially right now when people look at the supply chain situation and go, wow, we've got a problem here. Look at all of the other cybersecurity issues that we've heard for years and say we got a problem. So how are you working together to make sure that all of the things that need to be done, including the things you laid out that still are yet to be done, get done in a timely way and in a sustainable way?
Yeah, so JJ, that also is a great question. I've been told on occasion that the only thing that's harder perhaps than getting our arms around supply chain security is figuring out how the government's organized to deal with it. I don't necessarily agree, but I can take the point that when you look at the org chart, it's a pretty complicated organization chart. And I'm asked on a frequent basis when someone looks at that org chart, how in the world does that work? Or more kind of colloquially, who's in charge? It turns out that the stovepipes that are represented on that org chart, whether it's CISA, the FBI, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, my own office, the National Cyber Director, that's where deep and sharp expertise comes from. They're not inherently bad. But the question is whether when we apply that deep and sharp expertise, whether it's done in an integrated collaborative fashion such that it exceeds the sum of its parts. Is the arithmetic sum the limit, or is it actually something where 1 + 1 can equal 3? That's our job, is to make sure that we take those various strengths and apply those in a concurrent collaborative fashion such that they make the difference that they should. So you've asked a question about how some of these parts by name kind of work. We have described that CISA is the on-the-field quarterback. They have operational responsibility for the defense of the digital infrastructure that the federal government owns and maintains, in some cases leases, and responsibility for the support of the defense of the critical infrastructure, which is largely, predominantly done in the private sector. CISA's got both of those. But there are sector risk management agencies, gets complicated pretty fast, but you've got other organizations that have a direct relationship with sectors of interest. Department of Energy speaks the language of the energy sector and assists them in times of peace and tranquility and in a rising crisis. You need to make sure that those deep and sharp capabilities, kind of the synthesis that CISA would do, and the direct support that a Department of Energy would do actually complement one another. And there are a number of agencies in that space that are attempting to do just that. My job is to coordinate that such that they do complement one another. Remember that old beer commercial that used to run the gamut of, is it less filling or great taste? We need both, right? We need to make sure that we achieve both of these ends. These are not strange bedfellows. And then at the end of the day, one more character, one more organization worth putting on the street is we have a National Security Council. There's a person on that National Security Council who has responsibility for cyber. Their job is to ensure that we use the instruments outside of cyberspace, kind of intelligence instruments, military instruments, diplomatic instruments, financial sanction instruments, and so on and so forth, to bring about the necessary desired conditions inside cyberspace. So Kiersten, I, and our colleagues will be heads down inside cyberspace, while all of those other instruments of power outside are brought to bear to create the rational, reasonable conditions we want. I know that's complicated. The video is far better than the picture. It's a question of who's accountable for what, under what circumstances. There are good answers to that.
So I'll ask this question and say this. One of the things that you often hear when you start talking about defending the US, you hear that it's easier to turn a car than it is to turn an aircraft carrier. And I'm almost certain, I should just go ahead and say I am certain that the nation's adversaries know that. Is this organization that we have that's trying to deal with the nation's cybersecurity too big? I'll ask you that, Kiersten, and I understand you both, and Director Inglis, I want to hear from you. Director Inglis, I want to hear from you too. But let's go to Kiersten Todt first.
Well, I'll always choose to defer to the director, but I'll jump in for a moment. No, it's not about size. I think, one of the things, and Director Inglis really pointed this out effectively, we have this unique opportunity with leaders that work tremendously well together. I know CISA, Director Easterly, and Director Inglis's relationship goes far back, and we're extremely fortunate for the type of collaboration and partnership that we have with the Office of the National Cyber Director, with the National Security Council, Cybercom, Department of Defense, and the agencies. This is such a complex, multifaceted issue that you can't simplify the ability of the government to operate. And all of the elements that Director Inglis mentioned are not about complication. It reflects the complexity of the nation that we live in. And we benefit from that openness of this society. We have open infrastructure. We have an open setup and an open internet. And the benefits that we get from that mean that we are going to demand greater complexity into how we defend our systems. And so this is a whole of nation approach. Director Inglis talked about the sector risk management agencies, the government agencies. The other key piece to this is our industry partners, whether we're looking at entities like the Analysis and Resilience Center, which has financial and energy partners. We're looking at the information sharing and analysis centers. These actually are all strengths of our system because they add to the resilience of what we do and how we do it. One of the challenges has always been, for those of us that have worked in this space for a long time, is how do you bring them all together? And I will tell you, I was having a conversation earlier this morning about this, that there is a different call to action on this issue now than we have ever seen before. There are not real fiefdoms or turf battles. There is this recognition that in order to defeat our adversaries, in order to be strong, we have to work together. And I think one of the things that we saw with SolarWinds was an ability to understand that industry has tremendous intelligence that they're collecting for their companies and individual companies. And the US government has nation state intelligence. And when you combine all of these resources, we are stronger and better together. And there no longer has to be a theory of the case on that point. There's a recognition that this not only is where we are today, but it's absolutely where we will be going in the future.
Dr. Inglis, I saw your hand go up.
Yeah, so well, Kiersten's done a great job answering that, so it's tough to follow that. But I love your analogy of cars and aircraft carriers. I think that's how you characterized it. So many people think of it that way as well, given our experience in the physical world. But it turns out that it's neither of those, right? It turns out that this is not a single hierarchical machine with a single dashboard and a single rudder or steering wheel or wheels that kind of attain some traction on the road surface. It's about a whole bunch of pieces, individual, organizations, sectors, government, that all are concurrently applying their various methods and their various authorities side by side by side. And so it turns out that if individuals did two-factor authentication, meaning that when you sign into something, do you have to have a second means by which you can prove who you say you are, the code to your phone. If they did patching on a regular basis, if they change their password on a regular enough basis, don't use the same password everywhere. And if they had kind of the property of critical thinking, does it make sense for me to get a link from some person I've never met in some country I've never been to who's offering me $50,000? If we did those things, each of those cars in cyberspace, each of those individuals could turn the tide. 90% of the problems in this space are attributable to errors, mistakes made at that level. That's not to say that there aren't some pretty sizable threats that remain on the field, but those we can deal with using the other instruments of power we can bring to bear, not least of which some in the hands of government and some in the hands of some very capable private sector players. And so we need to make sure that we don't devolve this to somebody's got to do something, somebody who owns the single dashboard. There isn't one, right? There's a role for each and every one of us, no matter who we are in this space. There are only so many cars in the country. I don't know how many there are. I'm just guessing there might be 60 million cars. There are probably 350 million people on the internet right now. Mere babies have access to these devices. All of us have a role to play in achieving some degree of security.
It's very interesting you point that out about how many people may be on right now on the internet. I know that 331 of them are here. And I want those 331, if they have something to say, to let us know. There are a couple of questions here that I want to ask. I guess we need to be fairly careful with this because some of these questions are a little bit simplistic, but some of them are a little bit wordy. So here's one question. Is information still safe in the age of quantum computers? I'm not sure that this is necessarily something that the two of you want to dive into, but I will, your hand's up again. So there you go. Go ahead, sir.
So I'm going to assume that the question is about, the introduction of quantum computing will massively increase the processing power we can bring to bear to try to break codes. Information that is scrambled using mathematics, we classically say that it's been encrypted. You think is safe against someone guessing what the keys are because it takes a long time to guess all the possible keys. If you do it right, by some estimates, you can encrypt something. It'll take the age of the universe for a normal computer to find the key necessary to break in. And so you protected that data. If quantum computing comes into being, that factor goes out the window. What used to take the age of the universe in terms of that particular problem, quantum computers aren't good for everything, but for kind of guessing codes, they're crackerjack good. If quantum computing comes in, then all of a sudden, all of our estimates about how long this information is protected go out the window. So the time to get ready for that is now. There are quantum resistant encryption algorithms, mathematics that are actually good against that class of computer. We should be actually investing in them now. We should be encrypting information now against some reasonably kind of foreseeable future capability. It might be 5 years away, might be 50, but it's coming. And so I think that's the nature of the question. That information is safe at the moment, but if you expect it to be encrypted and safe for the next 10, 15 years, probably not a safe bet.
Interesting. Kiersten, Todd, do you want to say anything about that? If not, I've got another question for you.
Well, I'll just make one point to build off of obviously all the tremendous points that Director Inglis made, which is that it's very much about thinking into the future. And one of the things as we're looking at how automated artificial intelligence, machine learning, automation is all being developed, that is only as good as the data that goes into it. And so as we're thinking into the future about what we need to be protecting, as well as what we are looking to build, we can't just be pleased in the present. We have to really look at where we're moving, and our adversaries are certainly thinking into the long term when they're looking at building out these capabilities. And so to Director Inglis's point, this is very much about what we should be preparing for in the future to stay ahead of the challenges.
So I want to ask you a question, Kiersten, Todd, that sort of builds on that. You talked a little earlier about the talent management process that's going on, and the question I want to throw at you this time is DHS and CISA are a very large government employer for cybersecurity, and it could become the model for how the federal government modernizes talent management for cybersecurity related jobs. What do you see as the opportunity for CISA to lead in areas such as the creation of apprenticeships? We heard Anne-Marie Slaughter talk about that a little earlier too. So what's the opportunity there, and how do you seize it?
I think there's a huge opportunity. I think one of the things that we're focused on that Director Easterly has certainly prioritized is to make CISA the premier talent entity agency for cybersecurity. And what that means, it's not just about the talent of the individuals who work here, but it's how we recruit, how we bring in individuals, but importantly, how we build the talent pipelines. And so again, this goes to education and getting into schools and helping kids become fluent in these interests and understanding that they don't just have to be math and science majors. Again, this is interdisciplinary, and how we look at these problems and how we innovate for these solutions really requires bringing in people that are looking at these issues differently. I worked on something called the Cyber Moonshot, which came out of an effort from President Obama. And one of the key pieces when we were looking at how do we think innovatively about cybersecurity, there was the woman who came in from USAID, and she was talking about how they built Ebola suits and the recruitment that they brought in of talent to help build it. And there was an individual that they almost turned away at the door who ended up being a key part of the team. And she was a wedding dress designer because she understood breathability. She understood how to work with difficult fabric. And I think this lesson to me is so important because when we're talking about building out a premier agency, we've got to be thinking where we pull from and the skill sets and the talent that we bring in, again, not just today, but those that we're cultivating for kids that are in elementary school, middle school, high school, vocational school, community colleges, and universities. And again, one of the efforts that we're also working on is how we partner with these other educational institutions as well as nonprofits to be able to build the talent system and also to really recruit and create a pipeline, not just for today, but for the future.
It's an excellent idea and an excellent process that you lay out there. And you both have talked a little bit about the need to expand how we think and how we approach things. Diversity plays a key role, and that diversity of thought, the wedding dressmaker in this process. There are so many very simple things that we do on a daily basis that we dismiss because we're so familiar with them, but we forget how great they were when they came along. The zipper, things like that, things that can have value in the future as we think about these complex problems. And speaking of which, Director Inglis, you've often talked about cybersecurity for all, cybersecurity for many, and cybersecurity for few. Can you expound upon what you mean by that specifically? Do you think this administration will prioritize cybersecurity awareness or training as a way to address cybersecurity of the supply chain?
I do think so, and I think that we're already on that journey. I would credit NIST and the NICE initiative and others with paving some really important pieces of that road. But the all many few proposition says that there are a few of us who'll have the word cyber or IT in our job title. We don't have enough of them. We perhaps need to relook at what the requirements are that we've specified. Not every one of them needs a computer science degree, to Kiersten's point. We do need good, solid critical thinking skills, but we need to be more open-minded about who can fill jobs that have the word cyber or IT in them, open it to the broadest possible audience, get diversity working for us, and populate those jobs. There are many, the second category, who don't think that they have a cyber or an IT role, and yet they build cars, or they build airplanes, or they define logistics systems. They build supply chains. They don't think they're the cyber kind of expert, but they do things that implicate cyber. Their failure or their kind of missed opportunity of investing in resilience and robustness by design makes it such that some later person is going to come along and find that it's not a defensible architecture, and they then have to do something to clean up the mess on aisle 9. We need to make sure that they know something more in their professional development than they would based upon a curriculum that was defined 50 or 100 years ago. And then there's the all proposition. We've already made the case in this discussion that every one of us, doesn't matter whether we're in one of those kind of many disciplines or the few disciplines, every one of us in making use of cyberspace needs to know something more than we would just by using cyberspace. There's an apt phrase that often says, anybody raised, say, after the year 2000 and into this present day must be a digital native because they were raised in the midst of this up. That's technically kind of true, but practically speaking, not. Most of us are app natives. We know how to use the apps that kind of flow across the top of these devices, but the devices are so intuitive, the systems are so friendly that we actually don't need to know who's managing what beneath the surface. Ask somebody where the cloud is, and they have no earthly idea. It's outside this room, to be sure. When you ask them who's defending it, again, I have no earthly idea. When you ask them, do you know that the link in that email you just got was written by somebody else? Yeah, and that it's going to operate with your permissions. Oh, I didn't actually know about that powerful combination. Those are insights that we need to make sure every one of us has, so that we teach our kids as much about cyberspace as we teach them about crossing a busy city street, or how to use or be around a hot stove in the kitchen. Right? We haven't done that. And so there's an all proposition. If we solve all three of those, we've got a workforce or a population that is ready to serve the roles that they will serve, that they already serve in and through cyberspace.
Great answer, but all of your answers have been great today, both of you. We've got about 15 minutes, 20 minutes left here, and there are a few questions from that 300 plus group out there that's checking this out. We thank you all for joining us and tolerating my inability to get my head around some of this super technical jargon, but I do have a little bit of insight over the years in terms of asking questions. So I'm going to give it another stab here with some of my own, but first I want to throw out a couple of these that we've gotten from the chat. And feel free, both of you, to answer if you'd like. If not, just we'll move on. This question says, should we revisit what digitally signed code means? Should signed code do more than provide a level of assurance as defined in the issuing certification practices statement of the identity signer? Maybe the CPS should also include an audited statement that is a standard like NIST and the SP 800-218, the Secure Software Development Framework is. So either one of you want to try that? The root question is, should we revisit what digitally signed code means?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I'm not entirely certain I understand what the import of the question is, but I think I do. So when someone signs code, what they're doing is to say that this code is from, the person who signed it, right? You actually can reverse the process, not by re-signing it, but by applying another piece of mathematics to say, I can prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this came from the party who claimed to sign it. I think what the questioner is asking is, should we go further than that? It's not enough to know that this came from some company. Do I know something about the integrity of the information that they signed? Is there a gold disc back there that I actually get some vouchsafe because there's a certification of not just I signed it, but I vouch that this is actually resilient and robust code by design. I've actually mapped this against some set of tests, and the certification says that I'm giving you two promises. One, it's from me, and two, I vouchsafe for its integrity, its safety. I think that's what they mean. If they do, I'm all in. If they mean something else, then I'm listening.
Exactly. Kiersten, Todt, would you like to try to answer that, or should we just move on to the next? Because I can do that.
Well, I'll just use it as an opportunity just to talk about the investment that obviously we're focused on with stronger authentication. I'll take it in a little bit of a turn that we, as we're investing in these elements of understanding the processes and, even just taking this to a little bit of a different tangent, but the software bill of materials, what goes into a process, the transparency and the strength of understanding how we are looking at these issues, I think is something that this administration has certainly focused on. I know the work of NIST has been tremendous in this space. And as we look to invest, going to Director Inglis's earlier point, it's very much about not where we are today, but what are we seeking to achieve in the future so that we are ahead of the threats.
Okay, back to these questions. This question says, how are we aligning the cybersecurity realm? How are we aligning the cybersecurity realm with the law and international law? And I know from talking to some international officials from other countries, rather, that there's a whole void out there of understanding about how to deal with cybersecurity because the law is kind of vague on it. Director Inglis, let's start with you on that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. It's a difficult challenge. Cyber, of course, is to some degree borderless. There's an origination of something that happens in cyberspace. There's a destination, and the boundaries, the physical boundaries that it crosses between those two places kind of runs roughshod across various policy or legal or even state-based jurisdictions. And so the question is, how do we actually come to grips with that horizontal thread, understanding that at any moment in time, it lives in very different jurisdictions? There are several ways. First is we need to gather together like-minded nations to come up with some agreement about what appropriate behavior looks like and what inappropriate behavior looks like. In 2015, the United Nations sponsored a global group of experts to come up with what were described at the time as norms. These are appropriate uses for cyberspace or the internet writ large. These are inappropriate uses of cyberspace. And these are the expectations of what nation states should do if they're asked for assistance by other nation states. A very important kind of statement that cuts across those national boundaries. Two, we need to make sure that we have instrumented cyberspace such that if something comes from a jurisdiction outside of myself into a jurisdiction that I have some insight into, I can understand what the authorities or privileges are of that person. I can perhaps understand something about the origination of that, such that I have enough information to know whether what they're doing in my jurisdiction makes sense. But you're never going to put that story together if you do it from a cold start. And in many cases, you'll find that there is inappropriate instrumentation about what's taking place of a privileged nature inside your system, and because we haven't actually thought our way through what it means to have these lack of borders, a borderless system. There are other things that we can begin to think our way through about whether you have the right to do hot pursuit in cyberspace, crossing somebody's boundary in pursuit of that. I think that we need to define that as those are still governmental authorities, that you can't kind of have the Wild West in cyberspace, that there are some lines of demarcation that constitute what is appropriate for individuals and what's appropriate for nation states to do. But if you haven't thought about the reality of how cyberspace actually works, you might be lulled into this sense of, I'm just actually going after the miscreant who stole my stuff. I don't care that they're in Germany or on the backside of the planet. I'm going to run roughshod over everything in between. Of course, that's a transgression in and of itself. So I've just suggested some of the problems that perhaps kind of arise because of the nature of cyberspace. We do need to work through all of those and have a solid body of interpretation of law that allows us to navigate that space.
Thank you, Director. Kiersten, Todt, I've got a question specifically for you, but if you'd like to weigh in on that one, please feel free.
Well, I think the identification of global norms and standards with our like-minded economic partners to understand how we're defining what Director Inglis said, an act of cyber war, what are the repercussions? This clearly is a huge opportunity for collaboration and for action.
This question is addressed specifically to you, and it says you have, Kiersten, Todt, a Master's of Public Policy, but many graduates of NASP AA programs find employment in state, local, tribal, and territorial government. How highly would you prioritize collaboration with organizations that accredit public service degrees and NICE?
Well, if I understand the question, it's talking about how can we look and define degrees as elements of capabilities. Certainly the work of NICE and how its outreach to all of these communities is critical. I think when we see this, to my earlier point about how we build this talent management system, there's not one pathway. And this is so important because we have, I think in the past, we have deterred individuals from engaging in this space. Director Inglis talked about position descriptions and how we define a role in cybersecurity. I think that goes also to accreditation. We have to really open the aperture to understand that there are lots of different capabilities and backgrounds that will be important and critical. And to the earlier point about education, when a first grader is getting a device to learn how to read or to do math, they need to start understanding the skills that are required in cybersecurity. And as they grow up, they may choose different paths, vocational, community college. We don't know the paths that individuals are going to be on, but it's certainly our responsibility. Specifically, I'll talk to CISA, where I sit right now. It's our responsibility to ensure that we have that outreach to various communities really around the world that have different capabilities, that are coming from different spaces, urban, rural, underserved, to ensure that we are seeking the opportunities to attract talent that go outside of traditional talent pipelines, but certainly include those. And I wouldn't want to restrict that capability to just any one singular path.
Okay, back to some of my questions. Director Inglis, I want to ask you, as you look at your counterparts and all of the people across the government, and you so aptly pointed out earlier that we're not looking at this as one car or one aircraft carrier. We're looking at it as a whole bunch of different pieces that are all working in tandem and together. And I'm wondering, when you get together, or if you get together with all of these people, how do you manage to make sure that, and I'm not talking about process here, I'm talking basically about, there's so many ideas, there's so many things that need to be done, so many things that need to be dealt with. How do you make sure you don't leave those ideas on the table? An idea, back to the wedding dress thing, an idea that might make all the difference in dealing with a problem that's yet emerged. What's your process or your pattern or your thought process for dealing with making sure that you vacuum up all the ideas and essentially deploy them in the system?
What a great question. How much time do you have? First, I would say it's an iterative process, but there are 3 questions that we're attempting to answer in that process. These questions, if you answer them properly, make for a successful organization. Doesn't matter what that organization is doing. So let's consider that group of people, a very impressive group of people, present company, myself accepted, but a very impressive group of people, that they're an organization of sorts, that they have to achieve some common purpose, and they have to do that in a collaborative way. Here are the 3 questions. Do we know what it is we do together? Do we know what it is our collective charge? What it is that we together, and only we, can get done? I offer the proposition that if you're a transgressor in this space, you got to beat all of us to beat one of us. 2, second important question, do we know what each of our contributions to that is? Looking around the table, can everyone say, I know what I do to make that happen? And 3, do we each act like owners? Or are some of us employees just watching the train go off the rails? That's not my problem. Somebody's going to have to fix that. Somebody's going to get a talking to. If we all act like owners, we're connected to common cause, and we know what we do to make that happen, that's a conversation that then results in action, right? That's a conversation that results in collaboration, integrating forces. That's the kind of conversation that we're having at the moment, not just in the government, between the private sector and the government. What do we do together? What are our contributions to that? And do we all own a piece of this? That's the conversation we need to have, taking advantage of all of the diverse inputs, and then getting to what General Milley calls the saluting moment of, got all the ideas, we've kind of circulated through all of the brainstorming. This is what we're going to do.
That's very interesting. And we could talk, you're right, we could talk about that all day, because I've got a couple of follow-ups, but we only have a few minutes left on that. So I want to get to Kiersten Todt with this particular question. Some years ago, I think one of the most genuine and significant pieces of advice I ever got was from General Ron Burgess, who used to be the head of DIA. And he said to me, the biggest threat facing the US is the pace of change. And he talked about Moore's Law. For those who are familiar with Moore's Law, it's the platform change every couple of years. I'm supposing now we're probably at it changing every 3 weeks based on how much stuff comes out, platforms and gear and software, et cetera. But when you look at the pace of change, what are you doing at CISA to make sure you keep up with the pace of change and don't get swallowed up by it?
Well, you're going to hear me repeat a lot of the themes that I've already brought through, because I think it's a great question, JJ, and it's really at the core of cybersecurity, because we're not really ever going to be ahead of the threat. It's how we manage it. But it is very much about thinking into the future. And one of the key priorities of Director Easterly that we're focused on is innovating for the future. And what that means is it's not just the growth of the capabilities and the expertise, but it's also thinking ahead to where the adversaries will be, but also where we want to be. And this is both a defensive and an offensive approach. And I mentioned earlier, when we think about machine learning and automation and artificial intelligence and how we're looking at data. So when we think about the pace of change, we need to bring the best and brightest minds together to think about what are those end states, or where is this going? And we have to think innovatively about what we need to create. What is the structure that is going to keep us resilient into the future? And this very much focuses, again, on human behavior, but also understanding where technology can support us and where it also creates vulnerabilities. I think, we were talking a little bit earlier internally within the agency about a technology that does good cannot just be accepted as is, because certainly one of the things that we see is our secondary uses of technology that are not intended, the original intention, and that creates secondary negative effects. And as we think through these problems, we have to be anticipating how things are going to be used. And it's this idea of the power of negative thinking. If you were given something, what would be the worst case scenario? We talk a lot about tabletop exercises in this space and exercising and planning. The challenge often is that we plan and prepare for what we know we can respond to. We as a nation and as government and industry really have to be thinking creatively about the perfect storm. What is it that would take us down? What is that set of circumstances that would be challenging? And push ourselves to think and prepare for those things that in the initial moment are debilitating, but we can come together to think through how would we respond. I will just, one more point on this in supply chain. When SolarWinds happened, I had a lot of people say, well, didn't we know that the supply chain was vulnerable? Sometimes when something is known, it might be so overwhelming that we don't actually prepare for it. And as a nation and as government and industry, we have to be thinking collaboratively about preparing for that which scares us and paralyzes us in a moment, but then preparing us for it so that we're more resilient to that in the future.
It's a brilliant way to put that, and thank you for doing that. Just a couple of minutes left. I want from both of you, and I'll go back to you, Director Inglis, for some final thoughts, things we haven't spoken about today that need to be laid on the floor, put on the floor today before we go, that people need to know about in terms of cybersecurity, supply chain, et cetera.
Two things, if I might. A question that often comes up at moments like this, and it's not an unfair question, is what keeps you awake at night? And I would say it's perhaps not what you might think, which is, the scope and scale of transgression in this space, or the easy kind of the low cost of entry. What actually keeps me awake is the idea that this is somebody else's problem, that complacency that is suffered by so many people, where they say, I know it's a problem, but it's not my problem to solve. It's somebody else's problem to solve. That will defeat us in the end if we don't realize that this is a shared problem. It's a shared space. The solutions, therefore, are also shared. The second thing is, and I think that this particular session, this particular conference has highlighted the importance of this, is that people are the most essential element of the solution. Technology, of course, will matter, and roles and responsibilities will matter, but people will be the driving force as to whether we make a determinative, a substantial difference in the outcomes. We got here by essentially practicing division of effort. Each of us defending our patch, building our patch, defending our patch, kind of understanding what we can do to perhaps solve problems on our patch alone, right? That will not work going into the future, especially as we're being crowdsourced by transgressors in this space. So I just leave you with, we need to kind of arrest the tendency to think it's somebody else's problem and essentially double down on the people piece. If we do those, I think that we can turn the tide.
Thank you, Director Inglis. Kiersten, Todt, final thoughts about supply chain, cybersecurity, what we haven't spoken about today.
Well, something Director Inglis said earlier about ownership, I think is critical. And this goes to the point that he was just making. And we started talking about this human behavior, owning that this is not something that we all need a degree in. You know, we hear the analogies around, you don't have to be a car mechanic in order to drive a car. You don't have to be an engineer to be cyber secure and cyber ready. And I think this is one of the key pieces. You know enough to check the oil, you know enough to check the tires. What are those basics that you need to be doing, and that we all own a responsibility and an accountability. And I think in light of this conference today, I do want to make a strong point for the role of nonprofits and these organizations that do one thing or do a few things and do them extremely well. One of the priorities that we're focused on at CISA is being able to create a platform for a lot of the efforts that are out there that are working in foundations and nonprofit organizations to work with certain communities, and to be able to create more visibility and transparency to those operations so that we can truly synthesize the great work that's happening around this nation and truly around the world. Because again, this is a whole of nation, a whole of government, a whole of world problem. And we've got to be pulling in the resources across all sectors and industry and government. And finally, you know, it's collaboration with individuals and the leadership of people like Director Inglis that have set the tone for this administration and this agent and this work in this space that I think does put us at a unique time to truly impact change and make progress in cybersecurity.
Well, thank you both, Director Inglis, National Cyber Director, and Kiersten Todt, the Chief of Staff at CISA. Thank you both for being with us today and your great answers and taking time to explain these things to folks today, because it's very important. Thanks to NICE, thanks to NIST, thanks to all the folks that are involved in this. Thank you for the opportunity to ask these questions and engage with these brilliant folks today. And now, Brian Fonseca, back over to you.
Thank you, JJ. See you on the way home.
Okay.
Thank you both.
And JJ, thank you for moderating that fantastic session. Of course, Director Inglis and Kiersten, thank you so much for the phenomenal insight and all the work you do on the front lines in protecting our nation in cyberspace.